I think we have about 20 seconds left.
Okay.
Okay, welcome to this special edition of Tuesdays with Turbine. What day is it today? I can't quite remember. My name is Lee Fatzinger, CEO of Turbine Labs and founder of The Neutral, delivering insights a mere 5,280 feet above sea level. Today's episode is all about election 2020. I am so pleased and honored to welcome James Mejia, who is a political contributor with 9 News, one of the affiliates, television affiliates in Denver. James, you've got 40 different titles. I'm going to try and just rattle a few of them off. You're the CEO of Denver Film, a 9 News political contributor, so you're just getting your day started. And you also teach political advocacy at the School of Public Affairs at the University of Colorado at Denver. And you're also a former member of the Denver Public Schools Board of Education and at-large representative. Thank you so much for joining us today, James. It's great to have you.
Well, it's my pleasure, and it's an important day, so I'm very happy to be here.
It's an important day, and as I stated, we're now at 2:30 in the afternoon on Election Day. Polls are open across the country. Polls are going to start closing in about hour and a half or 2 hours on the East Coast, and so we've got you for 30 minutes this afternoon in the midst of what is looking like it's going to be the highest turnout election in history. It looks like we could have north of 150 million voters voting, all the way up to some estimates stating that there are going to be 160 million voters. So there's going to be a whole bunch for you to talk about this evening, and I'd like to just get started by, how many elections have you covered? First of all, let's start with that.
Oh goodness, the last dozen certainly, and and then some state and local things as well. But presidential's the last several, and watching the trends has been fascinating.
Yeah,
all the way back to Clinton, Kerry, the Bushes, et cetera. So it's good to have a little history behind us, a little perspective.
What do you think is the most, what is different about this one in terms of how things are being covered? I mean, clearly we're in the midst of a pandemic, how people have voted. We've got 100 million people that have voted prior to Election Day. That's a record. How is it going to be different covering this election tonight versus the previous elections that you've covered?
Well, it's really interesting. In Colorado, we've always had mail voting. We were one of the first states to adopt mail voting. And by the way, Colorado has already, as of this morning, surpassed our election turnout from 2016.
I saw that, yes.
So even before the day of voting, Colorado is beyond. Same is true with Texas, by the way. So, look for turnout to be extremely robust. And I would also say one of the other things to look at right now is going to be the age of early voters. It is trending very, very young. So who knew that a climate crisis, racial division, and killings in the streets, and coronavirus would, it would take all that to get the youth out to vote. But it's a robust voting block this time to keep your eye on.
And so do you think that this is going to be the most demographically by age robust, as well as so let's look at race, income, age. Are we going to see an even spread? So we're seeing an uptick in young voters compared to 2016. Who really dominated that block last time versus this time? So, right?
Yeah. More than more than other divisions, I would point to the gender division this time around,
Hmm.
whereas males are much more likely to vote for Trump than females in this election. Yeah, there is a massive points difference with regard to gender. That one is very stark. African American community very strong in the Democratic column, and again a very dramatic gender split within the Latino community. Interestingly enough, where Latino males are much more likely to go for Trump, Latina women are very strong in the Biden column. And so the gender split there in the Latino community is reflective of the overall division that we're seeing by gender across the country.
And what I've also read is that can even happen within the same household.
It is happening within the same household. It's amazing. You know, when you talk about you know, I hate to bring this up, but when you talk about deep divisions in our history, there were in-household divisions that made them so deep and so divisive. That is very true in this time around.
Right. Well, you know, when we talk about both the Black vote and the Latina and Latino vote, we're starting to also see demographic shifts in where people are living. 2020 is a huge year because it's also a redistricting year. And that is to accommodate for these changes in demographics. So we are seeing states like North Carolina, Georgia, and Texas either be in play, although I don't think that we know exactly how it's going to turn out if these states are going to flip from what was solidly red states into blue states this cycle. But what we are seeing is just demographic shifts that are happening that I don't think we could have even conceived of in 2016. Let's talk about Texas for just 1 second. So we've read a lot of reports and seen a lot of data that Texas will be a purple state potentially in this election, and will be a solid purple state in the 2024 election. What is happening in Texas right now?
Well, it's not only in Texas, but I would point the trend to the southwestern United States.
Yeah.
The influx of Latino population and the villainization of the Latino community with regard to the immigration question, those two things have really turned some states that had been red blue, solidly blue in some cases. And you're looking at Arizona, that in 2004 went Republican, New Mexico, Nevada, those went from red to blue within the last 15 years. Texas is following the same trend line a little bit later, and just a massive state. So it's taken a little bit longer, but the influx of the Latino population combined with just the villainization on the immigration issue. And even though it's not necessarily even a top 3 issue in the Latino community, when it's driven so hard, it really causes the Latino community to be alienated from the party that is driving it. And so the fact that Texas is in play is incredible. So I would point to the southwestern trend, with Texas being at the tail end of that trend, and certainly the fact that it's in play is an incredible thing, and certainly an advantage for Democrats.
Now, let's stick on this, the topic of immigration, because we're talking about demographic shifts within the Southwest, and I understand how the impact of these growing populations can have. When you talk about the villainization of the immigration policy, and you look back into the Obama-Biden administration, and just as a platform issue of the Democrats in previous administrations, has that issue also shifted? Were the Democrats more stringent on immigration policy 20 years ago, 15 years ago, and now it is somehow flipped to be a GOP issue of let's keep the borders more secure and stop the influx of both an immigrant population as well as refugees that are coming from other countries for their own safety. Because I remember being both ways.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, and this is not to say that the immigration conversation or perspective is a democratic one. You can take a president or a candidate like Bush Jr., who was very realistic about immigration, who understood that
Right.
it took the immigrant population to fill jobs that were otherwise unfilled. He looked at agriculture. He looked at the hospitality industry, and realized that that population was necessary in the United States to keep our economic engine moving.
Right.
He won New Mexico. He won Arizona. I mean, he won Nevada. So a reasonable immigration policy held by a candidate all of a sudden neutralizes the issue, and now you're running on other issues. And
Right.
the Latino population is actually a fairly socially conservative population in many regards.
That's right.
Roman Catholic, ancestry, and if it were not for some of the harsh criticism on immigration, I think you'd see a lot more Latinos going with more conservative moves.
So fascinating. Now let's move east to the other races that we're going to be watching today or tonight. Georgia, which was a Southern Democratic state, from basically go back to the 1950s, right forward, became a solid red state all through the 70s, 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, and is on the cusp of being a purple state. Whether it happens this cycle or the next one. Tell me about what's happening in the what do we call it? The Atlantic South now, because we can't really call it the South, because we're not going to see those same changes in Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, or Arkansas that we're seeing in Georgia.
That's right. I think you're seeing it in Georgia. You're seeing it a little bit in North Carolina. Those demographic shifts have much more to do with the African American population than anything else, and you are seeing some moves into the urban areas as well as the suburban areas, which has strengthened a Democratic position, has created a lot more candidates, notably in those areas.
Sure.
Women and people of color, namely African Americans.
Stacey Abrams and some of these.
Exactly. So all of a sudden they're on the national stage. The other thing to remember is that there is a very interesting Senate races going on in Georgia right now. And that's a whole nother topic. The Democratic attempt at taking over the Senate. Right. I think Colorado, Maine, and Arizona are likely, and then there are 4 others, which are possible. Georgia is one example. That Senate race is also fueling this presidential race, and so there's some excitement, there's some activation, and there's some momentum to try to get the Senate driving that presidential turnout.
So now the other state that we have a very interesting Senate race, as well as a swing state, is North Carolina, which looks like it's both neck and neck. It depends on the poll that you look at and the quality of the poll. But so that's the same demographic shifts that you're seeing in Georgia, with a concentration of Black voters, but also a migration into cities, Research Triangle, Raleigh, so on and so forth. When you have something like COVID, which begins to call into question the viability of urban areas, do you see that maybe there would be counter forces to that consolidation that we've seen in Georgia with Atlanta? And that city's beautiful and massive, and it's now a network of 40 cities that are seemingly all connected. The same thing with Raleigh in North Carolina. Is there a counterforce where maybe people are thinking twice about moving into urban areas, and that for political candidates makes these cities like Augusta, Georgia, or some of the smaller cities in North Carolina be more viable, that we have to pay more attention to them?
Well, there's no question you've got to look outside the urban areas, suburban, and even into some of the rural areas. There's no question that they remain important. The urban areas is where the strength comes from with regard to Democrats and with regard to the shift in population. But you can't take any of those other areas for granted, and certainly you're seeing a diversification, especially in the suburbs of those populations, and that's a national phenomenon, not just in Georgia and North Carolina. That the diversification of the suburbs is actually happening, which was very interesting to note. President Trump's messaging to suburban voters, because more and more he's not talking to just white voters. When you talk suburbs, more and more you're talking to a diverse community, not as diverse as urban areas, but increasingly diverse.
Now, okay, we've talked about 3 states that, based off of varying and different demographic changes, have moved from being solid red states into purple/leaning blue states. Let's talk about, is Ohio now sort of solidly a red state where we will stop seeing Democratic presidential candidates especially move there? Or do you have other examples where states that were in play a couple of cycles ago or in the last cycle have become less interesting to Democratic presidential candidates because of shifts in the other direction?
Ohio is a very interesting case, and it is not following the trend this time around of Wisconsin, Michigan,
yes,
those other states that are also formerly almost exclusively industrial. You're seeing Michigan and Wisconsin kind of come back to Democratic roots. I think the blue wall is back for the first time in a very long time for Democrats in the Midwest. It's going to be an incredibly important place. Pennsylvania, I put in the same category. Starting to veer towards the East Coast, but certainly that wall is going to be extremely important once again for the Democratic candidate in this regard. That's very, very important, because you've got Florida looming out there, which is its own ball of wax, and it has its increase in Latino voters, but does not look like Latino voters in the southwestern part of the United States.
Very interesting. Yeah. Well, and different demographics, different heritage. You've got the Cuban American voters, and then you also have got the more the descendancies of Central and South America, more concentrated in Miami-Dade than you do in anywhere in the Southwest.
Well, and don't underestimate the Venezuelans. Like the
Venezuela, thank you. Right.
And the Cuban community are much more conservative. The wealthier residents of those populations left. They much more align with the Republican ideology than they do the Democratic ideology. Conversely, you've got 300,000 new Puerto Rican voters who are residents in Florida, driven out by floods and hurricanes, and they're voting in a presidential election for the first time in their lives. And ironically, the lack of aid to Puerto Rico has created a voting bloc that is not in favor of this president. So you've got 2 competing trends, both within the Latino population, that are fighting against each other. And frankly, this election is going to be a bellwether for what happens in the future in Florida. It's going to be really interesting there. In just the Latino story in Florida is going to be fascinating.
The governor of Puerto Rico endorsed the president, And yet the 300,000 voters that are now voting for the first time are likely to trend towards Biden. What's the split here?
Those that could get out got out, and Puerto Rico needs all the aid it can to repair itself. And you do not make an enemy of the president of the United States when you are a territory dependent on the United States. You try to make friends, and you try to bring in the aid that you can. And frankly, looking out for the residents of Puerto Rico, it's hard to fault the governor for doing that and making a political move to help the population. So maybe that
keep your friends close and keep your enemies closer is what you're saying.
We're it might be a pass this year. Might be a pass.
Okay, got it. So Turbine Labs, as you know, is in the information business. We are monitoring and pulling in data around this and have been doing so since the last presidential election. And we've seen that we are now squarely in the era of misinformation, that this is an issue that voters and the public at large are going to have to get through in coming in any decision that requires external information. A lot of that has to do with how we, democracies, how we bring on our elected leaders. I want to read to you a few words that are trending today as searches in the United States by individuals that are on platforms looking for information. And these are become trends, which means that this is not just an individual here or there that's looking at. These are taking up a share of total search. So the first one is incumbent. The second one is civil war. The third one is how to register to vote. Three very, very different topics, but it got me thinking about what is civics education like in the United States today? And in your opinion, as an educator, coming from being on a board of a massive school district, probably one of the top 20 school districts in the country, where do we need to go with civics to prepare learners for the era of misinformation?
Well, the first thing I would say is, when Thomas Jefferson was talking about the importance of the fourth pillar, and that is of journalism, he chose that over many other aspects of our democracy. It's incredibly important as it checks and balances on our system, and as the most important checks and balance outside of government itself. So I would start with journalism, and the villainization of journalists in general, I think, has been a very dangerous development. That is the game plan of fascist countries to discredit independent journalism. And so, to start, I'm worried about the future of independent journalism in our country, the disappearance of newspapers, et cetera. However, there is an increase of available information. I think people are swimming in information and have a really hard time discerning what is good information, what's bad information. Therefore, they have tended toward identity politics, identifying with those people and those sources of news that most represent where they stand. And so you're seeing a little bit of groupthink with regard to obtaining information, and a lot more experts have been created because information can be pulled from numerous places, and there needs to be a doubling down, I think, of the education in our country, especially with regard to the basics of democracy, the basics of the Constitution, the basics of our checks and balances system. Those are some things, frankly, that I think have been slipping in the adult conversation that need to be shorn up.
Yeah.
In the K-12 systems of today's education.
Well, I have to tell you, my wife is a first-generation American immigrant from Europe, and became a United States citizen 7 years ago. And the test that she had to go through to become a citizen, and the information that she had to be prepared with of mayor, governor, elected representatives, congressional delegates, senator, vice president, what are some of the cabinets, is more than most adults know now. Have we crossed a point where there's just such disinterest because politics has become a blood sport that we can't get back to that? Or do you see that over time we will be able to get back to, it's important to understand issues rather than personalities? And this has been a long time coming. I mean, we have Instagram.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
Well, we've got to recapture the imagination of the American people with regard to the foundation of this country, why it was founded the way it was, and we've got to go back to the issues that are not partisan, but the issues that served as the foundation of a democratic republic. Those are things that need to be taught. The civics lessons need to be taught to this next generation. I haven't given up on that. I do not think it's all lost, but I do think we need to refocus and redouble our efforts. And frankly, just like the early voting reflects a very young population, because they're fired up like never before in this presidential campaign. Once they get fired up on these issues and the foundation of the country, I think the young people can drive the issue, frankly.
Yeah.
And they've got something to teach the older generations. Yeah.
Well, where do you think that comes from? Is that a privately funded, or programs that come from private enterprise? Is it innovation? Is it something that comes from the government itself? Or is it a combination of all those things that needs to make it happen?
I think it's a public school effort. And again, you really have to ensure that it is not partisan.
Yes.
But teaching checks and balances is not a partisan issue. Teaching about the importance of independent journalism is not a partisan issue. I mean, it's good for everyone.
Yeah, the importance of diversity of thought and diversity of perspectives is not a partisan issue. Correct.
Yeah. So I think you go back to those issues where we agree. I mean, let's assume that we still have hope for this country and a love for this country and what made this country great to begin with, and let's go back to those ideals. I think that's where you start, and I think you've got to take the politics out of it and instead focus on the policy and the foundation.
Well, I tell you what, I'm certainly gonna be starting there tomorrow with my friends that don't share the same political views that I have, and we've got to start somewhere, and tomorrow will be as good a day as any for us as we enter the next administration, no matter who prevails in this presidential election, as well as the down ballots. But James, again, I can't thank you enough for taking time out of what is going to be a very, very long day and night for you on the broadcast chair. We really appreciate your time and look forward to watching you on 9 News this afternoon and this evening.
Thank you so much. My thanks to Turbine, and please let me know when we can do this again.
Okay, you bet. By the way, I got my vote T-shirt on, so if you haven't yet voted, please go out and vote, be a part of the process, have your voice heard. Thank you, everyone, for joining us on this very, very special edition of Tuesdays with Turbine. We look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks so much, everyone.